All right, good morning. How are you guys doing? Tired. How's the exam line up for you with your other classes next week? Okay. My other class, they all have a lot of them have another exam conflicting, so I was hoping that wasn't the case for you guys. Okay, so today I want to talk about the Flint water crisis. This was um, making me start to feel a little bit aged because it's been almost a decade since it began. It feels weird because that was, I guess, well, 10 years ago I was in grad school still, but right after grad school I ended up moving to Michigan in 2014. I'll kind of show you on the timeline, and I spent a couple of years there, and that was basically the Flint water crisis. And all the math makes sense and adds up. It just feels like it was since I was just there. When I came here, I started giving this lecture as kind of a sort of a special topics, current events sort of a thing, while it was all fresh in my mind, and it was sort of fresh in everybody's mind. And it does a nice job wrapping up the entirety of kind of disinfection, water treatment sort of stuff for drinking water, but also tying in the fact that the distribution system itself is part of the treatment process in a sense. So that's kind of one of the takeaways we'll have from today is the water distribution system being a significant part of all of that. Okay, so first of all, what actually happened? And before I begin, how many of you feel like you've heard a lot about the Flint water crisis? Or at least a fair amount. Okay, so it's still, and is that from other classes or is that from just life in general? Just news? Yeah. So there's been some continued discussion and all that. So yeah, and one online says from the news. Okay, so hopefully I can bring some interesting viewpoints from a more technical perspective for you. You can then go back and consider what you've heard from the news and see how accurate or important that is. Okay, so first of all, what actually happened? And I should say Flint water crises. There's more than one crisis essentially wrapped up in this event. So first of all, and I guess the most obvious, the most severe or most concerning is the lead in the water, right? Lead in drinking water is never a good thing. But there's also a Legionnaire's disease outbreak associated with the overall Flint water crisis. And there were also times where the water being distributed, they had to add a boil water advisory because there were too many bacteria in the water they were sending through the pipes. And boil water advisories are moderately common for things like you have an earthquake and it kind of breaks some of the pipes a little bit and you have to go find and repair them. You're worried about the pressure drop, you're worried about water getting in, or some water main break for some other reason, right? You'll have potential for contamination to get into your pipe system. So you tell everybody, okay, well, even though the water is still coming to you, you need to boil it before you use it because we're concerned it's going to be contaminated. So they were doing that, and that was just simply because they weren't treating it adequately. So then they started chlorinating, over chlorinating, and so then they were creating too many disinfection byproducts. And so there was issues where their levels of disinfection byproducts, specifically trihalomethanes, were above regulatory limits, and so they were getting fined and dinged on that as well. So it was a kind of a vicious feedback loop there during their process. So we'll get into the details of how all this came to be, but real quickly, I have this little picture here. This is Michigan. Well, this is the glove, right? If you ever encounter anybody that's been in Michigan, they'll give you the mint, right? They'll say, okay, I live here, or I'm over here, or they'll talk about, okay, Traverse City, or whatever it is that they're doing. They'll give you that, or usually they'll probably do it like this, right? But I was like, well, if I do my left hand backwards, but regardless, there's the Mitt, and then of course there's the Upper Peninsula, which is up here. Some people say it's like the cat or something that's sort of just sleeping on a shelf or something. I don't remember exactly, but that's also part of Michigan. So when I moved, I was getting married, and my wife had a 2-year position in the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services, which was downtown Lansing. Technically slightly different than East Lansing, which is where MSU is. And if you talk to anybody up there, or if you talk about MSU and you say, oh, that's in Lansing, right, they'll always correct you. But no, East Lansing. They're like the same thing pretty much. So it's really funny. I mean, there's a distinction, I suppose, but they make a big deal out of it. So Flint then, and by the way, Detroit is over here, and Grand Rapids and so on, Ann Arbor. So Flint then is where the dot is, right? That's Flint, and that's in a larger county. This is Genesee County, something like that, that area. And so we'll talk a little bit about how their physical geography and location plays into all of this. And I'm going to essentially walk us through a timeline to give you kind of the story of how the Flint water crisis came about, so we can sort of discuss what all the implications were for this. Okay, so I'm going to begin and say that, first of all, in the 1900s, we had lead pipes, or at least lead solder used to join pipes, if not lead pipes themselves. So this is, kind of the initial source in some sense for the lead, at least way back when, and that was pretty common. And if you know anything about the Latin language and how it's informed our periodic table, well, there's a Latin word that sounds something like plumber, that means lead. So the word plumber comes from the same word that was used for lead, because back in the Roman times, pipes were often lead-based, right? Because it was something that we could work with. We could make a pipe out of it. It was common enough that you could extract it. It's one of the few metals that doesn't really oxidize super well, or naturally. Like iron will rust, right? So you can make iron. It's a pretty intensive process, but you find lead in a zero-valent kind of metallic form quite often. So it was one of the first things to use. This is lead, and kind of the same root for plumber, right, from Latin. So pretty common, especially a long time ago. And technically, it's not a problem to have lead pipes, so long as you operate in a way, we talked about this a little bit with our alkalinity and softening, in a way where you are adding mineral deposits to the pipes rather than leaching them away with corrosive conditions. So if we have the opposite of corrosive, so if you step back and think about the oxidative ORP, right, the oxidation reduction potential of the water, something we can measure. Basically, we want it to be operating in a way where we're mineralizing rather than deteriorating there. So, but that's the history. Then after that, in Flint in particular, and Michigan generally, what we might call the Rust Belt, kind of everywhere up there, there's a real large auto industry boom coming off of World War II especially, and just all the industrialization. We had a lot of auto industry in the area, and Flint in particular had a very large population of people working at these auto plants. That was a big source of livelihood and people. So a really big boom supported a pretty large economy, a lot of people, a lot of jobs. But after the 60s, and I don't know precisely, if you were to try to lay some blame. Maybe there was policy, maybe there was just international competition, and whatever the case, the essentially the industry started collapsing up there. And by the time the 70s and 80s were around, we really had a localized economic depression in that area. This is what we call the Rust Belt. That, really, if you have a large population come to a spot, it's kind of like the old gold mining rush, right? You get a massive population boom, and then what happens when the gold dries up or whatever? Then you have a lot of infrastructure, and now people are moving away, and that infrastructure has to support fewer people than it was designed for. So you have fewer people that probably also don't have many jobs, and maybe were the ones that weren't able to afford the chance to move away. They're stuck trying to foot the bill of all of this infrastructure that was designed to support 3 times their population. So that's going to be a very bad situation and kind of a negative feedback loop, potentially keeping very poor populations in the same situation and making it worse. So it's a pretty serious localized problem, and that's, this is one example of it, but this is going to happen kind of anytime you have that sort of situation where there's a economic driver to have a lot of people there and then a bunch leave. And at least that's my impression, right? I'm not an economist. I'm not an anthropologist or whoever would be able to study that sort of thing. But that gives us context as to why in the 2000s, the state government of Michigan decided to stop sharing revenue across different cities and I think it was cities, not counties. But essentially, they had a program for some time trying to support and help, let's say, Detroit, for example, also big auto industry, booms, busts, issues. While there were maybe some other cities that were never supported so strongly by the auto industry that were doing well, let's say Grand Rapids, I think would be a case. The state had a revenue sharing procedure where they would take some of the tax revenue from one city and help out the cities that are not doing so well. And this, to decide to stop doing that, and I think it was over that decade, I guess they phased it out, or it was just some point during that time. There's a question of ethics here, and I'm not going to claim to know what's right or wrong, but I think we could recognize that on the one hand, you really want to support regions or places where people are struggling, right? That's kind of an obvious, compassionate thing to do, assuming that you can do so without corruption involved, making people rich off of people suffering, essentially. So assuming that's fine, and I would presume that for the most part it was, you still have an issue that you are taking people's money that, it's almost taxation without representation, in the sense that it's taxation with that supposedly is, you're being taxed on it at a city level so that the city's infrastructure can be improved, right? So in that sense, it's unfair to the people that you're taking the taxes from. So there's a dilemma there. And like I said, I don't think I have an opinion what would be best, but neither way of it seems, it feels like a lose-lose situation, right? So regardless, that's what they were doing. And maybe that made sense after 40 years or so of the kind of subsidizing to try to help. At some point, a city has to be self-sustaining, or maybe that's their thought, right? So that was the situation, which is really, I think, going to make an obvious impact on Flint in particular, and other cities like it. So in 2011, then, the state starts appointing emergency managers over Flint in particular, and probably a few other places. And this is where things really, I think, get a bit sketchy. So 2011, I think, is the first emergency manager appointed over Flint. And essentially what this emergency manager is there to do is to manage their finances for them, because they have been going bankrupt, and it's, they're not able to sustain themselves. And so the state's like, well, if you can't manage your budget, we'll do it for you, and we'll force the budget to work, kind of a thing. And perhaps that seems a tiny bit justified, maybe, based on the fact that, again, the state's having to bail them out, or else people are suffering, kind of a thing. However, this is not an elected person. This is an appointed person, and so there's a whole lot of room for politicization, for negligence, for no representation, which we value very highly. And online, we've got somebody saying, if emergency managers don't cut corners, yeah. Well, in a sense, their job was to go and cut corners, sort of, because they're there to essentially make the budget work, whatever it takes. And so they're going to be doing things that the local people and local government did not want to do by definition, because otherwise they would have done it. So in some sense, they're there to cut corners. And as we see with the Flint water situation, they really, really messed it up. So in 2013, the emergency manager at the time, and these are like appointed every, I think a new one every year. Sometimes they would get reappointed, or it'd be like the same person was there for 4 of the 6 years, but it was like on 2 years, off 1 year, or whatever. So we had like 5 or 6 emergency managers there over the course of a decade, something like that. So whoever was there in 2013 decided that it would be smart to switch away from their original water source, which was the Detroit water and sewerage system. I think they've maybe relabeled that now, or it was technically called something else back then. They decided to switch away from that because they had been getting treated water from the city of Detroit. So Detroit was taking a bunch of water, I think from Lake Huron, if I've got that right, and sending it up through pipes. They're piping it up to Flint, and Flint was essentially purchasing. They had a contract with the Detroit water system where they would essentially be buying the water from them. And so, of course, that's a routine cost, and the emergency manager was thinking about it and said, hey, maybe, the math looks like it works out that they could, or they were aiming to save about $5 million over, I think it was several years. I'm trying to remember. I don't remember the exact amount. So they're saying, okay, well, if we put in our own water supply that will take from, and rather than backtracking through all these, I'll just pull up a map so we can look around on the Google Maps. So just give me one moment. So essentially they decided, instead of buying from Detroit, we'll go from, we'll take water from a different spot, and life will be good. We'll save money. We'll have our own water supply. Everyone's going to be happy. So I'll pull this over. One second. All right. So Flint is right here, like I showed earlier. They've been taking water from, let's not do that. Been taking water from Detroit. And so as you see, I got to pipe it, 30 miles or so. Detroit, I think, was getting their water from the river here. Is that St. Clair? Or possibly right around here at the outlet of Lake Huron. So they were getting decent water, treating it, sending it up the pipes. And then Flint essentially, they had a water treatment plant there, but it was just kind of a touch up. So whatever chlorine needed to be re-added, they could do that and just polish the water a little bit as needed. So they had a treatment plant, and then they were thinking that, or they were making plans that, okay, well, if they install a line, and I think there was something like, I think Saginaw might have also been part of this plan or something, to take from Lake Huron from over here and simply pipe it down to Flint and use that water supply. So that was their plan, and if all the stuff went appropriately, it looked like they could save some money. So at face value, makes a little bit of sense, but it was still a very bad decision, as we'll see. So in 2013, when Detroit's Water and Sewerage Department hears about that, apparently they're kind of upset. They're like, well, you could have given us some notice, or like talk to us about this, or rather than just bail on your contract here. So they give Flint a 1-year termination notice. It's like, okay, well, if that's the way you're going to play it, you have 1 more year with us. So that's perhaps we can give Detroit's Water and Sewerage Department some blame here for part of the pressure put on Flint. I think they redeem themselves, as we'll see, to a large extent, but still, perhaps we can place some of the a little bit of blame for what happens next on that. But a 1-year termination notice seems, I don't know, maybe that's reasonable. You have a year to get your next water hookup thing set up and ready. Well, it was going to take too long to get their Lake Huron planned renovations set up. So they decide to make use of, in the meantime, the Flint River. Now, the Flint River has kind of a pretty bad reputation in the area so this should be the Flint River running through here, I think. Yeah. So it kind of has a reputation of having been a bit of a toxic dump site for a lot of auto industry stuff and industrial things. Now, I suspect they would have been taking water from a little bit above the city, where maybe there weren't so many industries right there. But certainly it's not, at least the sediment in there is not so great in some places. So definitely not known to be a high quality water supply. The locals then would be pretty upset to hear that their water is going to be coming from the Flint River. And so everybody's going to be on edge about, well, maybe we can get clean water out of it, even though there's some issues. But then there probably was the impression from the officials that everybody's going to be whining about it. Right? So I would imagine that's what their perspective was going to be. So in April 2014, Flint decides to use the Flint River. And the key here is that the Flint River happens to have a more corrosive nature in terms of its alkalinity. So we talked about that last couple times. So the composition, the acid neutralization capacity and all that, it's just a little bit more corrosive, a little bit more acidic, a little more oxidative. And so it's, when they switch, really their major failing here is as they added, they kind of had to update their water treatment plant and certify it, say, yes, this can handle the Flint River, we are okay to do this. Whoever was responsible for checking, or likely there was multiple people, for confirming that it could appropriately handle it, failed to realize they had to add corrosion control. Turns out that the water they were buying from Detroit had corrosion control added. And corrosion control is really just phosphate. We call it orthophosphate. So really, this is the beginning of the Flint water crisis there as soon as they switch. And immediately, the residents start complaining about the water quality. They see that it's a little bit colored, it looks a little rusty, smells a little bad. Nobody's happy, right? So the residents are immediately upset. So corrosion control would be what you call orthophosphate. So phosphate itself is PO4 3-. It's probably some type of phosphoric acid, essentially. But phosphoric acid has like the four protons that you can deprotonate, right? You can deprotonate it all the way to PO4 3-, three, because you could have H3PO4, right? So that'd be phosphoric acid. But you could also do something like potassium with, let's say, 2 of them, 1H, PO4, add that to your water, and then you're getting a balance. So you can buffer it to the pH that you want based on how many hydrogens are there that you're, with whatever form you're adding it. So Detroit was adding corrosion control, some sort of phosphate. Flint, with their more corrosive water, was not. So then what you're going to have happen is, and this is what the residents were picking up on, was you had the pipes essentially having spent years building up some mineral deposits, now are starting to corrode those mineral deposits away and then corrode the pipes away. So as you do, you're going to get particulate matter, and particulate matter is one of the ways where lead can be ingested. And this might be particulate matter too small to like notice as a flake floating around. Of course, that would also work. So immediately the residents are complaining, and the officials are like, well, I'll get to you in 1 second. Well, they're like, deal with it because it's coming out of the water treatment plant and it's safe, right? And it could be safe in terms of you could drink that and have no health problems. Yeah.
I was wondering, like, that's how fast corrosion can happen.
So, as soon as they changed it, so that's a good question. So how can it happen that fast, like within the month or whatever? I expect that, first of all, just the change in water source, I would bet that there would at least be a flavor change immediately as soon as that water's coming through, because of the different source. Like you go to a different parish or something, you taste something different. But maybe with you, and if you think about it, when I'm drawing this timeline of like decades and decades, that seems like such a little time. But if you think about putting, if you were to take an iron or steel nail and put it in some water and then add a little bit of acid, whether that's soda with all its phosphoric acid, which they use the acidic phosphoric acid, or put like some lemon juice or something, and then you let it sit there for a month, that's going to have an impact, right? So once you stop and think about it in that reference, it's like, oh, actually that really could. And that actually brings up part of the other problem, coming way back to when our auto industry boom collapsed. We had that depopulation, and it's still, the area is depopulated, so there's a lot more water distribution lines than we need, and a lot fewer houses pulling water out, and so there's standing water issues, which kind of exacerbates that corrosion, exacerbates the Legionnaire's disease, potentially, we'll talk about. So whether or not the very first few drinks the residents were having were a problem, it became a problem really quickly. So they were right to be complaining, and like I said earlier, I think the city officials were probably primed to think that it's just people complaining. And that's me being exceptionally charitable to them. I think that they definitely could have and should have acted on this in a much, much better manner. So by August of 2014, which is, that's technically when I was done with my my degree. That was middle of the summer, the hottest point of the year in Michigan, pretty much, and that means there's just more biological activity in the rivers. So the Flint River had a lot of bacteria coming through, especially if it rained or something. And so then, out of the treatment plant, there were issues with too many coliforms, meaning bacteria related to the gut. So they recognize they're sending out potentially contaminated water, so they issue boil water advisories. They do that twice, and their response to fix the situation is add more chlorine. Well, guess what? Chlorine is corrosive, right? So they're now over-chlorinating because they have to. And by the way, this is another design failure. I think investigations have later found that the disinfection contact chamber was not sufficiently large to provide enough contact time with a typically lower dose of chlorine, right? So then we're doing really high doses of chlorine, which is then going to form all these disinfection byproducts, which is the very next thing, right? So the contact chamber not designed for the task. Because again, essentially what they're doing is they're trying to retrofit this, essentially what was probably more like a polishing station, take Detroit's river water that had already been treated a little bit, polish it up, and their engineering review said that maybe they could do it, and it should be safe. Well, I don't know if this was the emergency managers muddling up things, telling them to say it's safe when it's not, or if it's just utter failure of the engineers themselves, or what. I honestly would not be surprised with anything coming out of it. But whatever happened, the disinfection contact, the system really was not quite up to par, up to the capability of doing it, and they missed the corrosion control. So now they're over-chlorinating. So then also in August in 2014, they're getting hit with the high trihalomethanes, those disinfection byproducts. And so they're really trying to walk a tightrope there to deliver what should be safe water. So they're not even really sending out safe water sometimes. So they're on the verge of sending safe water most of the time, but like obvious issues when the situation is just a little bit bad, right? We want to design our systems that we have safety factors in place so that we should never be sending high coliform counts, and we can avoid high trihalomethanes. Okay, so also what's happening in August 2014, the city officials are still saying, and it's horribly ironic, and I guess this is maybe after they fixed the trihalomethane situation or balanced it, or after the end of the boil water advisories, perhaps. The city officials are saying the water is safe. They're telling the community the water is safe. You should drink the water. You should use the water. Meanwhile, in their city office in Flint, Michigan, the government workers there are refusing to drink the water and getting trucks of bottled water delivered so that they can drink bottled water. Yeah.
So were they actually believing that the water was safe because it was technically safe when it was coming out of their treatment plant?
That is the most charitable interpretation, and I wouldn't put it past somebody to think that way.
Yeah, I was like, how did they think that?
So to be as charitable as we can, just to repeat for online, we can say that they may well have believed it was actually safe because it was meeting the EPA's criteria coming out of the treatment plant, right? And now there are some checks that have to happen on occasion at taps throughout your distribution system, and there's like the lead and copper rule about that. ended up getting revised based on the Flint water crisis. Essentially, there was maybe there was some controversy about whether or not there was that was being done appropriately, or if the rules were being manipulated to avoid it. But either way, it didn't catch the problem fast enough. So that was another issue. I actually don't know as much about that. It would be a good thing for me to add, but I haven't gone into that yet. But it was revised in hopes that you'd catch this type of an issue more frequently. And the controversy had to do with, like, you're supposed to take X number of samples. You're not going to use all the samples because there's some statistical outliers sometimes, and there's a way to deal with the statistical outliers. And here's the procedure. And then the officials in Michigan were accused of not following or discarding samples that were high when perhaps they were actually just following the procedures they were supposed to with the statistical stuff. And then the rule itself was not sufficient. So I need to look into that at some point. That's just kind of another aspect of the thing here. Okay, one more question here. So at this point, was the water just not great to drink, or was the water not even great to bathe in? Okay, yeah, so that's a good question. And in fact, around this time, perhaps a fourth crisis was, in a sense, a sanitation crisis, in a way. So Flint residents started reporting skin rashes, and my wife was working with the health department there, and ended up talking with people, collecting surveys and things like that. And so I don't know if we ever learned whether it was simply people avoiding bathing because the water was so nasty and they believed that it would harm them, or if the water was actually harming them. I don't know at this point. I think it's the more likely thing is that it was people not bathing, perhaps. I'm not very confident with that. And it could have been the water was dangerous. I'll have to ask my wife to get the official, or if there's an official answer to that. Presumably, if it's, let's say, just a bit corrosive and therefore there's some lead in it, it would be a little bit dangerous to bathe in if you don't have a way to clean off in such a way that you won't contaminate whatever you're handling, right? So that would be dangerous, especially for children. But for an adult, if you had clean water to wash your hands with afterwards, maybe it's fine. But then they didn't, right? So that's not even good. But I don't think they're, like, maybe a skin irritant, but I suspect that just simply not having access to water that you feel safe using to bathe in is a problem in itself, right? So, great questions. Okay, so by this point, by the way, December of 2014, and I got married and moved up to Michigan in October. So that's kind of when I arrive on the scene. Everything's in full force. I'm just enjoying a few months of unemployment and getting used to married life and trying to publish some papers and look for a job and stuff. Figuring out my life, all that. At that point, I really had no idea about the Flint water crisis, because really not many people did in that moment. Obviously, the people in Flint and the people working on all of that, I'm sure, were aware that there were issues and that things had changed and all that, but I was ignorant at that point. Okay, so by December then, Flint had already spent $4 million on water treatment plant upgrades. So if they were planning to save $5 million over the course of several years, and they're struggling to get this water treatment plant up to par, which they didn't do successfully, and spent pretty much most of that money that they were planning to save, it's not looking so good on a financial sense. Okay, so January 2015, Detroit Water and Sewerage Department recognizes that Flint's in some deep doo-doo, and nobody's happy about it. So they offer to reconnect and waive the connection fee. And that's not trivial because the connection fee is going to be a lot of money. So the connection fee is not just, okay, we have to sign some paperwork, so I'm going to make you pay $100, right? This is going to be a fee that covers the engineering design required to decide exactly how to dig up the pipes, how to connect, to purchase, design, engineer, all of the components that need to go into these connections. It's probably not just turning a knob, you know. Even if it was turning a knob, you would still have to have some engineering design in place to handle the change in flow rates, the change in pressures, the pumping, things that need to go on. So this reconnection fee is kind of a big deal. Probably hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not into the millions, because depending on how much construction and stuff is involved. So this is, I'll say, a big gesture in terms of monetary support. So, like I said earlier, maybe we can blame Detroit for kind of snubbing them a bit, saying, "Well, fine, get out of here." And a year is maybe reasonable, but still, you could call foul play on them for forcing it to come to that in a sense because they were fussy. But I think that at least have some redemptive aspect here, offering to reconnect, waiving the fee, kind of reinstating, say, look, you guys are having a hard time of it. You're welcome back on the line for free. We'll continue our contract, kind of thing. Now, Flint might be thinking to themselves, well, we didn't want to be on you, so why? And apparently that's the emergency manager's decision. It's like, we're fine. Get lost, they just reject it. That's happening. So this is January. They've been almost a year now on this bad water that is poisoning their residents. And they're like, no, we're too good for you. By March of 2015, Flint City Council votes unanimously to reconnect. And of course, the emergency manager being probably in the throes of, what's the term? Propagation of error. It's like when you've made a mistake and you don't want to go back on it because then you're admitting you've made the mistake and you're what's that word? What's the word for that? Or term? Like when you've made a mistake, you kind of know it, but you don't want to admit it, and so you continue on trying not to even though it probably will make it worse, your psychology, you just don't want to go back. Yeah, it's like being stubborn, in denial. And there's a question online here. Does the emergency manager become liable for all these poisoned people? It's a very good question. I'll walk you through a little bit of what the legal ramifications have been, and I should probably take a look back. This is a pretty exhaustive Wikipedia article summarizing some of this, and summarizing some of the civil and criminal lawsuits going on. Certainly, I think they should be. Yeah, it's sort of like the term is like it's like denialism. It's like when you're playing poker or something and you
double down.
Yeah, you're kind of doubling down on it, but there's a term. I'll find it at some point. Anyway, yeah, it's basically just continuing in his error, right? And wants to not be wrong about it, right? So sometime mid 2015, the first real detection of the lead problem finally occurs, and this is, if you think about it, this is a year too late, right? More than a year too late. So there's a pediatrician, or I think maybe several pediatricians, find that there are elevated levels of lead in the children in their practices, and so they start contacting different people looking for help, trying to find a way to get attention to this, to discover whether or not this is related to the Flint water and all of this. And at some point, one of them contacts a professor from Virginia Tech, Mark Edwards, who has worked with some of the water distribution systems in DC. I think there was a somewhat similar issue back in the mid 2000s, and has done some work there. And he ended up getting involved with his research team. It's interesting. My wife, who was kind of aware that there was a problem at hand, I don't know at what point we realized there was a lead problem, because I think it was mid 2015 when anybody did. And by the way, I got a job at DEQ. I think I started in February. Fortunately, I was in the wastewater permitting, not in the drinking water. Ironically, at the time I was like, oh man, my graduate degree is mostly sort of the drinking water, and I would have preferred that. So glad I was not involved with any of that. So I was not at all involved, but I was at DEQ, MDEQ, me, between I think February, and then I decided to ultimately go back to kind of academic. So I stayed there about 6 or 7 months, and by September I started a postdoc at Michigan State. Okay, so anyway, this Mark Edwards guy, I think when he started getting involved, the state, or at least the people within the state government, were viewing him as maybe somebody just trying to get attention and trying to just publish about this stuff. But I think he actually did play an important role here, in part because he was willing to point blame at the EPA for potentially hiding some of this, or shoving some of it under the rug and all of that, and really equipping the pediatricians and the local citizens with capabilities to collect water samples and sort of prove this lead issue. There is a lead issue in the water, and things must happen. So it wasn't probably directly him only, but the pediatricians especially were really critical in making it known that there was a massive problem here, poisoning our children. So by October 2015, finally, the problem is technically fixed, in the sense that Flint switched back to the Detroit water sewage system. Then you have the corrosion control. Then you are nearly immediately, like we were talking about earlier. It's probably surprising how fast that's going to make a difference, given that, in the scheme of things, we don't think about like a couple days being a long time for a switch in this type of a system. But then again, you drop a nail into some corrosive water and wait a day or two, you'll see the difference, right? So as soon as that water is really flushing through the system, again, some issues with the residence time and dead zones and all that, it's going to be fixing the water crisis in many ways. In January 2016, the governor finally admits that there's also, by the way, a Legionnaire's disease outbreak that also killed some people. I don't know if the lead killed anybody directly, but there's this disease, and it was mostly people on their deathbeds who then died because they had pneumonia from Legionnaire's disease, but it was still the cause of death, and it was still a legitimate outbreak. Very likely, we eventually had some good data to show. I'll talk about some serious corruption controversy there as well that my wife had firsthand dealings with. I'll talk about that in a couple minutes. But that was going on through 2014 and 2015, this Legionnaire's outbreak, particularly with one hospital, which wishes they could remain nameless, but I will name them because we are allowed to. they should be known for that. So 2017, the CDC was able to link finally the Flint water to the Legionnaires outbreak. So we're pretty sure that, and now Legionnaires disease, also known as Pontiac fever, is actually pretty native to Michigan. It is just common in the environment, the Legionella bacteria. And it was named for a Legionnaires group at, I don't remember what exactly what that group does. It was a athletic or some sort of gathering, and a lot of them got sick because essentially the bacteria will sometimes collect in like a water distribution system or in pipes, a water heater. It can withstand a little bit of heat, and then when you aerosolize it, it gets in your lungs and you can contract it that way. But it's actually pretty hard to spread from person to person, even if you're sneezing and stuff. It really has to be highly contaminated aerosols getting into your lungs. It's not known to spread person to person hardly at all. So it's probably has something to do with the state at which they're in a water treatment system. And then you've got showers, aerosolizing and stuff. So also water cooling plants sometimes will have a bunch of it. So some facilities that need to be treated for that. We'll talk a little more about that soon. Okay, by January last year, former Governor Snyder, 8 officials were charged. That doesn't mean they are convicted, just charged with 34 felonies, 2 misdemeanors. 2 officials were charged with involuntary manslaughter. I think that's related to the Legionnaire's disease. So other legal outfall coming and or perhaps wrapped up by now. But if we go, I can just show you real quick. If we were to go to the wiki for the Flint water crisis, if you want to know a little bit more about it, they're expanding more and more as time goes on. There we go. This is not it. It's simple. I don't want simple. I want the actual article. Thank you. There we go. Okay, I don't know why that happened. So we can take a look, and so we've got the timeline. We kind of just covered pretty much most of that, although maybe we ought to stop there for an update. But you'll see they have different state and federal legislation, emergency responses, criminal and civil lawsuits. So if you're curious about what specifically has happened to the different people involved and liable, you can find some there. Okay, let's just take a quick look at what they say for. I looked at some of the other stuff. I forgot to look at this part before this morning. Okay, yeah, there's some sort of controversy about Michigan Supreme Court using a one-person judge and jury, grand jury, for the indictments on these cases, and they said, no, you need more than that. You can't just be the judge. The judge could indict somebody, but you need a real jury. So anyway, that's going on. There's some stuff, but yeah, we'll see what happens. Certainly, it has felt like it's taken a lot longer than it should, but maybe that's sometimes a good thing to be careful. I don't know. Definitely catching the lead in the water took way too long. Yeah.
Pretty sure like 3 weeks ago, the judge dismissed some charges.
All of which charges?
Against like government officials.
Wow.
There are a bunch of articles that came out about it.
Okay. Interesting. So I should take a look into that. I guess this hasn't updated. Yeah. So that would be shocking. And on the one hand, some charges might be misplaced, and in fact, I think sometimes there are scapegoats, but definitely there were people at fault. So there should be charges. So hopefully those are not improper dismissals. We can hope. Okay, so and by the way, if I have not activated it yet, I will activate a couple of different papers that I'd like you to take a look at. I'll probably post a quiz like I've done for the crypto outbreak. I'm not asking you to read the full papers, but take a look and read as your curiosity dictates. I do expect you to have an understanding here about kind of what the operational issues were, what the failures were on a technical sense, and in particular, the lack of corrosion control when using the Flint water was a big one. That inadequate treatment capacity was an issue, therefore they did excessive chlorination, and combination with that excessive corrosive chlorine, they also had that just simply a corrosive water supply, that change in water supply. The other thing was the many vacant homes we talked about a couple times. That means the water age, so how long the water sits in the pipes before being sent out of a tap somewhere, is a lot higher than we would normally design, and probably a lot more variable. Some locations you probably get your water within a day of being sent out of the treatment facility, and then some areas it might have sat in a kind of a dead zone sort of for 5 days before being sent out. And we don't typically consider that to be a good thing because our residual chlorine will decay. And in this case, we're going to have lots of corrosion issues there. I guess that's in a way going to happen regardless. But okay, so now I want to tell you a little bit about the Legionnaires outbreak. And these are slides that my wife prepared while she was at MDHS. They might have reformed and labeled a different group now. But so about the Legionnaire's disease and outbreak. So legionellosis, the technical term here, it's going to get you sick. It's going to be pretty much a pneumonia, bacterial pneumonia. So you can treat it with antibiotics. But it's a pretty significant. I mean, pneumonia is not anything to be taken lightly normally. Particularly a problem for older people, immunocompromised, can be quite serious. But it's not really known to spread person to person, like I said. So we don't actually expect that to be a thing. So when tracking a disease like this, and with any what we call reportable diseases, we might learn a thing or two about COVID and the flu here separately. So essentially what happens is you have some exposure to a disease and somebody gets sick, right? So that happens, that's disease, right? So if somebody goes to a doctor at that point, then or a hospital, and they're diagnosed with what's called a reportable disease, then let's say the doctor thinks that it might be Legionnaire's disease. Well, then they'll take some sort of a test and diagnose it with a confirmation of some sort. Maybe that's they'll take a bacteria culture sample and see if it grows, or they'll do some DNA test, something like that, right? So they're going to maybe send it to a laboratory, or maybe they do it in-house. So either they send it out to the lab. If they do it in-house, maybe then they'll be able to report the information directly. For reportable diseases, this is required. They have to alert the local, if not state department. And so either route it goes, it will ultimately, that information will be shared with the state department. And essentially the CDC is sort of over that in a sense. So that's kind of giving the CDC access to it if the CDC wanted to kind of study it further. But ultimately there's a state entity that's a subsidiary in that sense. So whichever way it goes, ultimately we have some kind of a surveillance system is what we call it. And that's going to be looked at and used by the State Department there to track where these diseases are coming from, how many cases do we have, and some information about the patient so that they could be contacted for surveys or contacted for whatever. So let's say there's a norovirus outbreak. It's reportable, goes through this process. MDHH recognizes, we have 20 cases in Grand Rapids this week. So then they'll go and do some surveys. Say, okay, where have you eaten the last week? Where did you eat the day before you were sick? Where did you eat the day you were sick? They'll conduct a survey like this, and then they'll find, look, everybody ate at, this restaurant. And then they'll go to the restaurant and figure out what's going on. They'll talk to them, and they'll have some route of dealing with the outbreak. That's kind of their plan. And so when I say it's only for reportable diseases, the common cold is not reportable. So we will never have this type of information. We do not have a surveillance system. The flu is not reportable. So we never have direct counts of deaths or incidence rates of the flu. All of that's actually estimated. There's apparently good ways to estimate it, but it's not a precise counting because it's not a reportable disease. Okay, so, and of course, a lot of the urgency or the push to do a lot of testing for COVID is because we made it reportable so we could track it and everything. But as I think is fairly apparent, COVID is on a trajectory towards common cold type of a disease in the sense, at least it has been acting that way in terms of spreading and its mutations. So as that becomes more and more like that, this reporting system may make less and less sense because what do you do about it? I mean, there's not maybe much to do about it. The actionable items here would be limited for that type of disease. Flu is kind of similar, and I think perhaps the same reasons there. So anyway, with this system, one of the things I mentioned about what happened, or rather didn't happen, was when the state was recognizing there was Legionnaire's disease. My wife has like kind of an intern, sort of a fellow type position, so sort of a junior member, was working with people and recognized that the local health department in Genesee County, which is where Flint was, I forget how many N's and S's there are, but we'll just say that's good. She was essentially working on the surveillance system and was directly telling them, hey, you must, with her colleagues there, you must take DNA sampling here from the patients because we need that to be able to connect it with anything else. Apparently, they weren't doing it. So let's say that Genesee County did not take essentially DNA matching samples. So we had no idea if this strain was related to the Flint water or not for some time. I mean, the CDC eventually maybe extracted that data from somewhere and was able to connect it, but that information was absolutely critical to know where this Legionnaire's disease was coming from. Is that related to the Flint water? Is it related to this hospital A that was apparently a problem? A lot of cases associated with it. I'll talk to you about that in a moment. But they were just refusing. Apparently the Genesee County Health Department had been wonderful and a really good program for a long time, and then there was a big changeover of staff and things, and it just supposedly went downhill from what I heard. And they just really, really did not want to work with the state health department for whatever reason. Can kind of understand it given all the trust issues and everything going on. So a little sympathy maybe, but they even were trying to email the CDC directly, which they have no authorization, and they also included some. Can you guys keep it quiet? Sorry. It's probably better they didn't hear me. I don't really care too much. Sorry. Anyway, so they were like not functioning well. They were not doing the right thing, and just being a pain in the butt to the actual people that could help them. We're trying to help them. So then we're missing this key data for many months. So that was a real problem because Legionnaire's cases, I mentioned earlier, it's kind of natural. It's endemic, I guess you'd say. There are cases every year, but it's like 1 to 2 per month, if that. It's sort of some baseline. It happens. It's out there. But when you get a spike like we did, hey, look, April to May 2014, does that ring a bell? And then it also will show you as well. So this is data my wife helped collect or compile. Essentially, you have an outbreak, especially during the summer, and it's most common in the summer. But this is pretty clearly correlated with when the Flint water changed. So the question then is it the Flint water? Can we accuse that, or what? So the fact that they did not include that was a real issue. So recently, I found that a lot of this data had been published actually, and essentially there was this Hospital A exposure. Now they call it Hospital A, and here's the juicy part that I was talking about. This is McLaren Hospital. And the reason, well, I mean, it's pretty common practice in some study to not name it or whatever. But during the study, during the discovery of all this, probably even before the governor's January 2016, we said, admitted that there was an ongoing Legionnaires outbreak. Again, my wife working at the state had been told by her superiors that their superiors, like the very highest up people, said, do not talk about the hospitals. Don't name it, because they're buddies with the high ups at McLaren Hospital. So total corruption, total awful corruption involved there. People trying to save face at the cost of people's lives, right? So essentially what happened is the Flint water apparently, or maybe just the change in the chemistry could have been part of it, but I think that the Legionella was making it through regardless. And so the red here are cases that were exposed to Hospital A, so McLaren Hospital. The blue here is residents who were on Flint River water. So there's some question about, did you get it before you came to the hospital and now you're hospitalized? But a lot of these are just hospitalized patients who were in the hospital, exposed to it at the hospital is the thing. And then there are some that had some exposure or had no exposure to either the Flint water to their knowledge or to the hospital itself. So there's other cases around. So A here, it says cases with the hospitals. Like I said, B, cases with and without exposure to the hospital. So just kind of summing those. But then it also says arrows represent the date of Legionella control interventions in the plumbing system. So apparently they did actually do some control, and that would correspond to around this time. We'll see in a moment, not all of these were sufficient. So see, the arrows represent data of interventions. These are just extra chlorine, hyperchlorination. Really probably was not sufficient. So these lines. And then these dashed ones were So superheating and chlorination. And then probably what they should have had all along was these guys, they started putting in chloramine additions. So basically making sure there's residual, what do they call it? I'll just say implementation. So chloramine dosing to essentially provide a base level of this residual chlorine that we expect to be in systems. Now, hospital wastewaters are usually, hospital water systems are usually managed fairly carefully because of how important it is for them to have clean water. And so even though they had been doing some procedures, I suppose, probably was not sufficient. I mean, maybe it helped a little bit here, but they were still having cases, still pretty clearly. And in fact, here's another graph that maybe more clearly shows the problem. This is not patients. The previous one was patients. This is percentage of positive water samples taken from their taps in the hospital. How many of them were positive for Legionella? And then on the right axis for the black, that's the concentration in colony-forming units per liter. So had thousands, tens of thousands of colony-forming, thousands of these bacteria per liter, or perhaps hundreds of thousands. So definitely quite a lot. Here we have the hyperchlorination, so just adding extra chlorine seems to help a little bit, but we still have positive samples, right? There's still an issue even after this guy, and this would be January. Actually, I'm not sure what these are. I thought these were just the months. Maybe I'm just not recognizing right. Another chlorination here didn't really do much. Now, once they did the hyperchlorination with the heat and then added the chloramine, then we're in a spot where it seems like things are doing well. And remember, they didn't admit there was a problem until here, right? So there were literally people dying in this hospital because of the hospital, because of this. So pretty, and the link to that paper is here. Seems to be a good article. I haven't read it all yet. Some of that data is tabulated here. This was a snapshot from 2015's data that my wife had been working with. But essentially, we just took a look at that in terms of who was exposed to the Flint River water, who was on a private well. There are some unknowns here. Some people don't know what kind of water they're getting. And so when they're surveyed, it's just, I don't know, So that kind of analysis was interesting. So that's about all I have, I think. Yep. So any questions from here? Yeah, so it's a kind of a sad story. A lot of corruption, a lot of poor decision making, and big need for corrosion control. All right. So we'll see you on Tuesday next week.